Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Don sitting in the host chair today. That seems like a very strange thing to say because for the most part, I haven't done that for about 3 or 4 months, but I'm happy to be able to do it today. But I'm not doing the effort here alone today on A Fork in Time. So I can see on my screen, you'll just have to imagine this in your mind. I'm joined today by Chris Coppola, and I'm not going to fall in the typical trap. So I'm just going to say I'm joined by Chris Coppola.
Yeah, but keeping the seat warm, nice and warm for you, isn't it?
You have been. Chris has done an excellent job of keeping the seat warm. And I also am joined by Eric Bond. Eric, how are you today?
Oh, it's good. I finally got those cigarettes I promised to pick up for everybody. So yeah.
there you go. We're all good. So as I had mentioned in the brief episode that I released, or update that I released a couple of weeks ago, we've had a lot of things going on and a lot of personal lives around the podcast here over the last few months, but we're getting back in the rhythm now. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited about being on a recording here. And I was actually trying to figure out when the last time was I had been in a recording, and it's been a little bit of a time. So it's good to be back. So Chris and Eric have joined me today, and today we're going to pick up on a thread of something we've talked about previously. So it's similar in some ways, but it's going to be separate. And so I guess this year we have done a couple of episodes, one that Chris and I did that centered around what if Texas had divided into multiple states? And then we also, Chris and Robert Koshu did an episode that was around what would have happened if Mexico and Texas had created the Tex-Mex combo. That was actually one of my favorite episodes, or pair of episodes to listen to, just because we have great Tex-Mex food and it made me hungry when I listened to it, but also because it had good content. But today we're going to go to a slightly different place on the map, but a similar concept, which is what would happen if a state that we know today had been divided into multiple parts. And so we're going to go all the way out to the Pacific coast, and the state that we're going to talk about is California, which is a monster state, both in terms of physical size, but definitely in terms of population. And in fact, Chris, we were talking off podcast a little bit before. You were doing a little mapping and demographic fun off topic there. There's some pretty big population numbers out there, right?
Yeah, you can basically split the state in half, and one of them is going to be still the second largest state, and one of them is going to be the fourth largest state.
Yeah. And so that's how it is. That's how big it is to begin with from a population standpoint. Of course, it's also geographically large. Not geographically large as Texas, which barely, I don't count out Alaska because there's parts of it nobody would live in or go to. So I still think of Texas as being the largest, like, real state. That's what I think of here. But you guys can disagree with me and probably will as we move through this. But so California is a large populous state. It's also a diverse state, right?
Correct. It's also my home state.
Yeah. So Eric's going to be able to bring unique contributions in terms of insights here to what it's like to be from California, as we sometimes say here in Texas, and what that means. When I think of the diversity of California, it's diverse geographically. There's no doubt about that. Northern California is not like Southern California. Even Southern California, the different parts of it are somewhat different in and of themselves. In Central California, the Central Valley, versus the Bay Area versus, the wine country versus, the various parts of Southern California. But it's also very diverse ethnically and politically as well. So it has all of these various ways that those cut. And is it a fair thing to say, Chris, when you were looking at some of those population things, depending on what methodology you wanted to use to divide the state up, you might come up with different ways of doing it, right? If you're looking at trying to balance the electorate, if you're looking at trying to make the geography work in contiguous ways, you'd come up with different ways of drawing a line, right?
Let's be perfectly honest here. Anybody drawing any kind of political map line has no intention whatsoever of balancing anything. Balancing is the last thing on anybody drawing a political map's mind.
See, I've been away long enough, Chris, that I was going to be naive, and you just sort of punched a big hole in my naivete. I thought the reason we did this here in America was to balance everything and make everything fair. And you mean we draw lines on maps for different reasons that may benefit one party or the other?
Everything is fair and balanced. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah, it's a free market of ideas that never benefits whoever has, a vested interest.
And it does actually look like some of these lines were drawn by an invisible's hand.
Just saying. Yeah.
Odd
So,
rings?
just what we thought we would do as our jumping off point here. By the way, there have been something on the order of 150 plus different partitions of California that have been suggested, recommended, in some cases actually introduced into the legislature for consideration, other times just floated in the public.
To be fair, most of those were at like 3 a.m. in The Hague. Like
it sort of looks that way, by the way, when you look at those maps.
Yeah.
But it is by far the state in the United States that has been considered or thought about being divided the most in its existence by far. And we'll talk a little bit, I think, about what the reasons are behind that as we work through maybe some alternate ways that would have worked out here. But there was one time that they came as close as they ever came to dividing, and that's going to be in 1859 and sliding into 1860, where, just to give a little of the background here, one of the things that's required for a state to be admitted into the Union, into the United States, is you have to meet certain requirements that are in the Constitution, and then other things that have actually been put into law, or at least practice in terms of how they're done. But one of the things that's required is that if you're not a territory, by the way, the Congress has pretty broad authority when it's a territory that wants to become a state. They can pretty much decide where those lines are based upon what they vote to do. Yeah, you do have to come in with a state. You have a state constitution, constitutional convention normally inside the territory. Have enough of your citizens saying, "Hey, we want to be a state, not just a territory." But coming along, there's a lot of leeway in terms of how Congress does that and has drawn the lines. You can see that throughout the history. But if you're making a state from a part of something that was already a state, it's a little bit different. And so, Chris, what are some of the examples of where that's actually happened in U.S. history before we go down the California path here?
So probably one of the first ones was 1820. Everybody talked about the Missouri Compromise, but the other side of that was the admission of, if we're going to admit Missouri as a slave state, we have to admit someone as a free state. And that was, if you can believe it, picture Maine. At one point, Massachusetts was kind of like a Michigan. I'm not going to say this too fast, just so I'm keeping all of my M's straight. But yes, Massachusetts was two different geographic. It was split by New Hampshire.
Right.
And they decided to admit the part of Massachusetts that is northeast of New Hampshire as its own state, as Maine.
And that required Massachusetts to assent to that division. And there was good reason for them to do that because of what was going on in the Compromise of 1820 and the balance that was happening there. That's how you kept, this was most of those compromises. Seems like every single one of them had Mr. Clay involved in them in some way, shape, form, or fashion. He, the great compromiser, was designed to balance the Senate because that was the main thing you needed to balance. The number of representatives in the House was going to be balanced by population anyway with the census, but a state gets 2 senators regardless of its size, and that's where the balance has to be. So Maine is an example of, it used to be Massachusetts and now it's an entirely different thing. What other examples do we have from U.S. history?
There's
another example we have from U.S. history is, I think, Don, you would be the best person to speak about it, which also gets into some of the trickier aspects of statehood admission, is the Republic of Texas. As you know, everybody was either very much for making Texas a part of the Union, and some were very much against making it part of the Union. mostly again due to the issue of slavery with that Missouri Compromise Mr. Clay so masterfully designed.
Yeah, and
He
so in the
said
case
with
of
sarcasm.
in the case of Texas, part of the what happened there is, of course, it had been its own republic, an independent country for 9 years, at least.
And they will never forget to remind you of that fact.
Yeah, it's what we do. It's in our DNA. Although, by the way, that independent country was absolutely in debt, broke, and was going nowhere. But other than that, things were great from 1836 to 1845 in Texas. But to Eric's point, they shrunk down the territory, the area, gave things back essentially as territory that eventually became, well, parts of 4 other states, I think at least, became part of what we know as Colorado. Not the Colorado we're going to be talking about here shortly, by the way, but parts of what became Oklahoma. But they're the northern border of Texas, the Texas Panhandle. The top of the Texas Panhandle is the 36th parallel. There's a reason for that. That's where the line got drawn across. And in fact, Texas, depending on who you read and who you believe, either does or does not have the right unilaterally to divide itself into 5 states. That's a whole other question, because again, Congress retains some right when it comes to the admission of these states, and it would have to be the consent of the existing state, like we're talking Massachusetts giving Maine permission to be something different. Eric, you're going to say something?
No, I was very scared that we were going to have to talk about United States versus, I think it was white, after the Civil War, when Texas tried to say like, well, we had a legal right to secede, but I'm glad we're not getting into that because it makes me so infuriated. So all good.
And it gets tricky because Texas can argue we voluntarily entered, we can voluntarily leave was part of that, but it's, sort of no backsies is just sort of what the other side of that was. You can't go back.
As the memes would say, play it again, Uncle Billy, but let's not get into that right now.
Yeah. And then the other one that immediately jumps to mind to me that's a big one is West Virginia being formed out of Virginia. And the reason I bring that up is that one, was that really with the consent of the state that was, ceding the territory? Well, when you're in rebellion and you have claimed that you're no longer part, maybe we don't pay as much attention to what you say or don't say about that. Were you gonna say something, Chris?
Yeah, I was wondering. I was kind of holding that back to kind of throw out there as like, hey, actually, the Civil War didn't stop states happening.
Right.
But the other thought being, I'm thinking about Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson stayed in the Senate. He was the only senator to stay from the
I'm looking it up right now.
The traitorous areas. Who did? Was there a rump grouping that? Because I know the West Virginia counties did not vote for secession, but those counties, I guess, delegates did still constitute a legal authority. Is that how it happened?
I didn't spend a lot of time because that wasn't our primary topic here, but I think it is interesting to note. I'm reading just very quickly on the fly here, is that there were the leaders from that portion of Virginia, which is really the northwestern part of Virginia, that they did come together and they petitioned for this. But as best I can tell, and a listener can correct us and go to our website and send us something and let us know otherwise. My understanding was there was not even, like you said, there wasn't even a rump sort of fake Virginia approval thing that actually happened. The U.S. government just sort of said, there we go. There you are, your state.
Well, no, but like if they, other than the presence of a quorum, if enough of them got together, they were still the recognized delegates of the state of Virginia and could have asked to be admitted as this other thing. Anyway, this
We
isn't
digress.
about, yeah.
Yes.
So we digress.
We
And, you know,
digress.
not every population center who wants to become a state does become a state. The early Mormon settlers wanted originally to create a state called Deseret, and
Correct.
the U.S. said no dice.
Right.
You know, and even today, the struggle for statehood for some of our current territories, you know, goes on, and they're all looking into their own issues.
Yeah, we've talked about. I guess that was actually on maybe the room where it happened. I think is where we actually may have hit this topic a little bit. But DC statehood for a territory like Puerto Rico, you know, others that exist. This is, you know, this is not. This is. It's been a long time since the 50th state was admitted in the form of Hawaii, but it's not that there can't be this happening again, either in the form of a division or in the form of the new admission of a territory that would meet the qualification for statehood. If you're going to ask me the most likely thing for that, I think Puerto Rico would be that. But, you know, there's been a lot of opposition to that as well, because there are benefits to remaining a territory and not becoming a state. And so you're right. Not everyone is there.
And most recently, go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, and most recently, like the House just admitted a new bill that will be considering a plebiscite for Puerto Rico to let them decide, do you guys want to stay a state? Do you want to be a free association? Or do you want to be entirely independent?
Right. And the other thing which is relevant to the topic that we're going to have here is there have been a number of modern efforts in California. I'm talking within the last few years of things that have made it to the referendum level at the state, or have been introduced in the California legislature, or have just made it into the public mindset again about looking at various ways to divide that. By the way, most of the time there it's divided into 3 parts versus 2. So we'll probably come back and talk about that here at some point. But all of this coming full circle. So there is precedent for this happening, a state being divided, the Maine, Massachusetts scenario, the West Virginia scenario, other ways that territories were carved up and redone and formed into states. But California was a recently admitted state in 1850, after the gold rush in 49, erased, get it as a state. And it came in as a singular large territory with nowhere, back to the conversation that Chris and I were having off podcast, nowhere close to the population that we think of California as having today. In fact, the population aspect that we think of California today is very much a recent phenomenon. We're talking last, half century, a little bit more century, maybe?
Honestly, to kind of put it a little bit of perspective on it, California's population didn't really start blowing up until the last state was admitted.
Right.
Yeah.
Just about the same time.
And in fact, I saw a graphic today where the 10 largest cities in the United States, Los Angeles becomes the first one in the West when it, I guess, moves into the top 10 list, is in the 20s. But it's not the Los Angeles that we think of today in terms of being one of the 2 largest. I mean, this is as it's just entering the list, and then the shift comes more over time, such now that only 3 of the 10 in 1910 in the Northeast still reside in the Northeast, and or in the Central Plains. Chicago and New York are still big cities, and Philadelphia is as well. But everything else has shifted west and south in the process. So what is unique or different, we've chased the rabbit. We've gone around the block, but what's really different about this 1859 attempt by California was it cleared a lot of the hurdles that most of these others never had, which is sort of the point. It had achieved approval by both parts of the California legislature, both its legislature and its Senate. It had the approval of the governor, and they had shipped this request off to DC with their senator coming to be an advocate for it. It had everything sort of going for it that is more along the lines of what made it work for Massachusetts and Maine, and then it ran into a little roadblock. And the little roadblock was the timing. You gonna say something, Chris?
Yeah. Let's talk about what roadblock did it run into, and how is it a roadblock considering what is about to happen to West Virginia?
I think that is an interesting point, and probably why it's relevant that we mention West Virginia is eventually we will have these states that come into being there. West Virginia being the Union version of Virginia,
Yeah.
as opposed to obviously the Confederate version of Virginia. But you still had the delicate balance that existed there right at the time of Lincoln's election, in terms of you hadn't admitted any states either slave or free, I guess, since what the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. And we saw what popular sovereignty had done to that. I mean, that's a precursor in many ways, of course, to the war itself. So, the roadblock that it hits is public opinion and the politics in Washington, right?
In some way, but again, how is the roadblock for California different than the roadblock for West Virginia?
That a rhetorical?
Or putting it out, I'm wondering. I mean, like, there was very clearly a reason, a relation between West Virginia's admission and the war. The war never really got anywhere near California. So go ahead.
May I?
Yeah.
So one of the main things that kept, I don't know if we really want to go into this now. Basically, Southern California would have become known as Colorado,
Correct.
which is going to make this very confusing. So I suggest we use a different name. But basically, this Southern California Republic, SoCal, if you will, the main issue that they were having politically is that the Democratic Party was the majority party in California. The guy who was sent to Washington, D.C. was a person who very enthusiastically, very hardly doesn't make much sense, very enthusiastically pushed for the Missouri Compromise and was known as a hardcore Democrat. And one of the state's senators who kind of gave it its name, Andres Pico, Pico became a brigadier general, but was quickly dismissed afterwards because a lot of people were worried that he's going to switch sides to the Confederates because he was a slave-owning rancher in Southern California. So one of the main things that kept it from being split off was that fear of, like, are they going to use the Missouri Compromise to suddenly bring in slavery, since a lot of these are very well-moneyed rancher families who have really benefited from adopting the U.S.'s peculiar customs.
That basically Southern California would have become another quote-unquote border state.
Exactly. So that's kind of the main issue. Andres Pico would actually be dismissed, again, because of that, and had his land seized by the Federals because he might have been conspiring with Confederates.
And again, Eric, I will accede to you as the California history person that I see on the screen here versus me because of geography and experience and everything else there. But of course, when the dividing line for this planned partition was the 36th parallel, it was not arbitrarily set. It was that same line that had been established, essentially all the way across. I guess not in Kansas, Nebraska. What was the 54? Was it 54, 50 or whatever the thing was there that was the dividing line in Kansas, Nebraska? But that's not right.
No, 54-40 was Canada.
Was Canada? Yeah.
Yeah, that was the Canadian.
Yeah. So the Kansas Nebraska, the Kansas Nebraska Act, popular sovereignty is what led to that, obviously, and what happened there. But to Eric's point, the reason for the division in California was something of an economic, the difference in the southern parts of the states, the economy, the ranch economy of the South versus the economy of the North. That was part of the reason for the division. And ultimately, if you remember 1850, California enters as what? California enters as a free state
Mhm.
as part of the balance that's there. And so to have a second California, and you're right, they proposed to call what the southern part of California, I think we will call it Southern California or SoCal, just to not confuse folks. The planned name was Colorado, based upon the river that would have made the eastern boundary, and still does today, of California. And this is well before the state that we know as Colorado later down the road came into being. So calling that Colorado, it would have been the first Colorado would have been there. And so, the Oscars live from Los Angeles, Colorado, that's what we would have had in an alternate timeline. But you're right. There was a concern about border state, or it even becoming essentially a de facto Confederate state to some degree. In the war, California did raise regiments that actually came and fought on the Union side in the actual timeline.
Yep.
So our departure point here, it's been a while since I've done one of these. I have to remember, we have to come to the fork, right? That's the whole point of the fork in time. The fork that we're going to assume here is, for whatever reason, I guess we can talk about how that would have happened, but instead of it meeting that opposition, that some other path would have come forward that would have allowed Southern California to come into being,
If I could go ahead and raise a question here.
Sure.
The entire Compromise of 1850, the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, all of these things was because we admitted California as a unitary free state.
Correct.
What if we just push this admission and the split of California up 10 years and admit 2 Californias?
Okay.
That accomplishes what we're talking about. And the other thing is, you don't have the added stress on this system of trying to come up with something to give the Southerners.
Right. Which is
in
what
the
you
Compromise of 1850.
Which is what you would have had to do in whatever I guess would have become the Compromise of 1860 to make this happen. Something would have had to give something would have had to give to create Southern California in 1860 to balance that out, right?
Yeah, I think it would be more likely that as some kind of political compromise to allow SoCal to be its own state would have to be, you have to also still make it a free state. We will not allow it to come in as a question. It has to either be free or it has to stay as part of California. To which, for guys who are way far away, they're not going to be able to contribute much and start to the Confederacy, since there's such a vast swath of territory between them and Texas at closest. Probably, I think that would be a more politically savvy argument on their part. Besides, they're still rich.
Yeah, I do like Chris's idea of, if we're really going to go back and have the division in time here, let's make it, that's the way that it came in 1850, right?
Because again, then it's not a state. You're not dealing with a currently constituted state. We are rushing to get these geographic areas admitted because of the gold discoveries. So rather than just tying ourselves in knots and making it that much harder, we'll lop off the southern part.
I like the what's the that I'm forgetting the term here when you something is it's Occam's razor. Let's do it the simple way, right?
Right.
Yeah. So okay, so let's do that. So we just buy fiat there, which is one of the things I love about a fork in time. We can just buy fiat, do all kinds of things. We just created 2 Californias. We'll call them Northern and Southern California again, not to confuse the whole what is Colorado issue. So they come in 1850. So there's a Northern California and a Southern California. Moving forward in time, what's the impact? What's the ripple of that fork? How are things different if we don't have one big unified California?
Are we still allowing for Southern California to have slavery?
Let's answer that question now while we're deciding things by fiat. How do you think that
Yeah.
ought to play out? There was a desire for it to be there because of the nature of the economy, right?
Yeah, the problem is that most of the slaves that were being used were Native Americans, which was a holdover from some of the earlier settlements in under Mexican administration and going into them as a free state. Is that while not officially slavery, it was still like, hey, you are in crushing debt to this man who I can't remember his name right now, but basically he claimed to be German, but he was actually from Sweden. And it was a system of you are under crushing debt to kind of more of a fiefdom to this one landlord. And it was basically slavery in all but name. So I do think that it would be a slave system. How much it would cost to bring slaves over from the East all the way out to California, that is going to be something that probably is only going to be the most wealthy of slave owners.
So, by the way, just to put a couple of things out there. One, Eric, you just described the American Southern economy up until like the 1920s. So,
Yeah,
not that big of a problem there. Two, the United States government really didn't have a problem with anybody mistreating Native Americans in any way they chose to for a long period after this. So they definitely would have been fine legalizing whatever that turns into. I think we're just dealing with another slave state. And by the way, a slave state, a border state more specifically, a border state, by the way, that doesn't even technically border the Confederacy, so matters just that much less when it comes to emancipation.
Right. Now, do you think the fact that they would have a higher Hispanic population would probably affect how they're treated by Congress when they do send their representatives?
Expand on that a little bit.
So some of the ranchers were typically of Spanish Mexican descent. Most of them got into state office without issue. However, then going all the way east, like in Florida, there were still high Spanish settler populations from their time under the Spanish Empire. I'm just saying, do you think that'll be an issue once they go to a more homogenized east to, say, go to the Senate and Congress?
I don't necessarily see that as an issue.
A lot of these, they would be also very Catholic. That might be more of an issue.
More likely. I mean, these people, again, referencing the Tex-Mex episode, they're very likely to be almost peninsulares. They're going to be almost indistinguishable from what is considered that might not be considered European at this time because they're Southern European, but I think it's the Catholicism that's the bigger issue for them. And as long as they're not playing footsie with the Confederate side, I mean, as you know, again, Lincoln is not trying to abolish slavery in any way, at least publicly. That is not his stated goal. I don't see any issues with them straight through the end of the war. And I feel at the end of the war, what will happen is, again, like the economic system you described actually was built in the American South after the war. I don't see a need to change anything here.
It becomes the path of least resistance for a lot of ways just because it is. Mm-hmm. And I think you could even argue that, if this were happening in 1850 at the time of its admission, there could have easily been a path that would have created the North and the South, with the thinking the North was going to be free, the South was going to be slaves. Some other ballots, came into that. And again, we're only having to deal with, we're isolating the California part, not ignoring that something else might have happened somewhere else on the map that was the balancing aspect of this. Because ultimately, where I'd like to see us go in terms of the historical what if here is how this ripples forward over time, because eventually there is the westward expansion and the shift of population centers out to modern California, unified big state California now,
Right.
in a way that I think you would still have very large population centers where they are today. They would just be not in one unified state. And what would that mean in terms of the way, that played forward throughout history, all the way from the Civil War to present, but particularly the way they would play out to modern times, to now?
I would say I do feel like there's going to be one significant difference in a Southern California as its own political entity. And you touched on it a little bit, Eric, which is going to be, I feel like it might be almost like a Louisiana, in that even in Texas, because you have so many Anglo settlers that came in, it's a little different. I think Southern California has a distinctively Hispanic, Latin, Catholic feel to it. That it, since it's not combined with the Anglo prospectors up north, or also all of the other populations that we're about to get to coming in up north,
Right.
It does have a really different character.
Yeah.
It already does in our time, but I think that's a little more so.
I have to ask because I am a Southern Californian, so I just want to make sure we check all boxes.
Yeah. And one of the things that we were talking about off podcast, Chris and I were looking at some of the electoral maps. Because the first place I immediately go when I think about a different configuration is, imagine you have all of the population that you do today in California, just in two separate states versus one. So the immediate thing that changes is it's a different electoral college than we know today, because there's two different sets of electors. There's the Northern California set of electors, there's the Southern California set of electors, and they occupy 4 seats in a collective Senate versus 2. But I don't think it's as easy as some people might think it is today to figure out what's red and what's blue, even in that new configuration. Would you agree with that, Chris?
Definitely. It's the interesting thing looking at it is, and we talked a little bit in many states, if you look at the state based upon like square mileage, it should be a red state, except square miles don't vote. And you have these islands of Democratic voters in a lot of places. And even the division that we're talking about between Northern and Southern California, where the population is, there's still going to be blue territories. Now, they're distinctively different blue territories. They're different sides of that coin, especially given how politics evolved. Maybe they wind up on different sides of certain things. Do you have, Eric, thoughts?
No, I agree with you.
Okay.
I mean, when I think of California today, again, using the blue-red metaphor, the electoral college aspect, which is not the only electoral aspect, obviously, of what goes on, and the representation in Congress, for example, when you have 47 seats, something like what are the number of seats in California now?
I believe it is 47.
I think it's 47. That's the number that jumps out at me. Is that you're going to have a diversity in that 47, obviously, when you get particularly on the House side of things there. But traditionally, California over the last 30 to 40 years of presidential electoral cycles has been a very blue state. It's been a state that has not been, for the most part, but the last time it's somewhat competitive, as Chris and I were talking about, 76 is when you might be able to make the argument. And there were some unique aspects, I think, of that election because of who was in that election and what had happened on the Republican side leading up to that, for example, is an aspect of that, having a former governor playing into some of the politics that's going on there. But, most of the time today, when you're drawing out your electoral map of the United States, you immediately put California in the blue column today.
And also just thinking about everybody's election night experience, you're seeing polls close across the country. And you have to realize California's a 53, by the way, 53 reps.
Wow. It's gone up.
Plus 2 senators.
Right. So 55 electoral votes.
So whenever you're sitting there and, this bothers me. Whenever you're sitting there and polls are closing, even starting into the central time zone, and they start calling states, at the back of your mind, there's almost 60 votes guaranteed to come down on a way that we can't count yet.
Right. Yeah. From historical and polling data how it's likely to come. And I guess the reason I bring that up is the first place I go in my head, somebody could show me things that would point this out differently. I think both Californias in the split California scenario are both blue states. One is just more blue than the other one is. The Northern California is the darker hue of blue. And you might have situations where, at least historically, the way it's played out, Southern California may be a little bit more of having some purple elements to it at times, but definitely today, the northern part of California would be about as blue as you can get in most of the United States, I would think, right?
I would say that it really depends on where the cities are, because we really like to collect into small groups into one area, and then we get very mad that we don't have as many seats. That's just a whole other complaint about how that gets broken down. But essentially, yes, the more rural areas do tend to be more red leaning. The more areas to where you are packed in with a ton of people tend to be more blue. And that's kind of been the main issue with Northern California, which is more rural and feels that they are giving a lot of their resources down to Southern California, which needs them because they're a desert. And Southern California says, well, when you start actually making money, either through entertainment or Silicon Valley or some other draw, we would be more than happy to provide a kickback to you.
That's the one thing I'd say. We think about when we talk about Northern California, you're thinking the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of places in Northern California that are better described as Southern Idaho that are going to be very, very, very libertarian, conservative leaning.
Back to your point, Chris, I agree with that. The difference there is what is the population density in those areas and how it impacts.
Right.
And again, I think Eric hit upon a very important thing. The immediate place that's easy for me to go, sitting half a continent away in Texas, is I start thinking about what is the impact of this in a presidential election, because I'm not ingrained or dealing with what are the state level politics inside of California, which are pretty complex. I mean, you mentioned there, the natural resources in the state, water. I mean, water is a major thing in all of the American Southwest, and is particularly true for Southern California. The big unified California and its southern part today, or what would be Southern California in a divided California, is a tremendous consumer of the water resources inside the boundaries of what would be those two states or the one state today, and geographically in the area just in general. I mean, the whole reason that southern area would have been called Colorado is because of the Colorado River, which forms the boundary there. And the Colorado River is the primary source of water for 7 states in the West, and certainly for Southern California. The state variety, or the southern half of the one state variety today. And the politics of, today, the capital, by the way, being in Northern California, Sacramento, the politics of that are the state level politics are very different than just the presidential every 4 years. This has an impact aspect of what it would be. It's easy for me to want to focus on that as my point without thinking about what does this mean day in, day out for residents that are in California, at local level, state level, county level, that kind of thing.
Yeah, especially considering one of the things that originally in our own timeline kept California from being a slave state was that, unfortunately, it was one of those territories that very much wanted to make it an African American free zone, very much like what happened with Oregon, of like, oh, we will solve the slavery issue by making sure no Black people get here. That is the plan. So that's kind of what tipped it in favor of being a non-slave state, because they were like, well, you can be a non-slave state. And they were like, good, that'll be our plan. So that's also going to be a very interesting diversion with a now Southern California Republic. Let's call it that. That sounds like a pretentious enough name for this pseudo state. But within 100 years, it will probably, if it continues on a current trend with us, it'll be one of the most populous states in the union, as well as the wealthiest, especially when you consider its natural resources, mostly oil off of the coast.
Which is I think that's an interesting thing that you bring up there too, Eric. Most people forget that there are petroleum resources in California, because after, was that in the late 60s that there was the rig incident, the incident offshore there, the platform incident, and California being very green, very, they have oil. In fact, all throughout the city of Los Angeles, hidden in what looks like buildings are there is oil production out there. There are refineries out there that bring the oil there locally. It's not just brought in by tanker to be there. So one of the things that ran through my head was, in whatever would have transpired, I was thinking 1860, but Chris has us reset to 1850 is when this would now. Would that have been the same moving forward? For example, could we be looking at Southern California, the state, rivaling a Texas or rivaling another oil producing state with an entirely different way that the economy may have played out in that different version of Southern California?
I don't know that it rivals a Texas, only because I'm not sure that the deposits are offshore. They're a little harder to get to, but I do believe you don't have the state regulatory impediments that you do today because of it being joined to Northern California.
Right. For example, you wouldn't see. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, if there is a spill at these offshore refineries, because it's going to be affecting them directly in their shoreline, they're going to have to, and they are going to have to be the ones who would have to take that on themselves to clear up and deal with the damage. And since it's a smaller area and it's more confined, meaning it's going to interfere with their other oil producing operations off of that coast, maybe we see something, but there's going to have to be a huge accident first before that would spur them on to take any stronger regulatory push.
Yeah, and again,
or maybe they're incredibly forward thinking, but
most of the time when oil and gas is involved, the answer normally to that, by the way, is no. I can speak also from personal experience when it comes to that. But one of the things that ran through my head there, again, thinking down alternate timelines here, which is what we do, is imagine if there's more of a petrochemical economy in Southern California. Maybe there is less of it still would have been there, less of the agricultural dominated economy that exists, that's the non-entertainment economy. And don't forget for a minute, the entertainment economy is a very important driver of that of that Southern California economy today, and I think would be, even in the other scenario, for all the reasons that people are attracted to. I remember reading something referring to the climate. There is a Mediterranean-esque climate, is the way that they were describing it, which I think is a fair way to do it. But imagine if there's more petrochemical, maybe there's a little less something else when it comes to agricultural, and how does that play out, or how does that change things?
And as another thing, looking at where the line probably is going to be cut, the Central Valley is probably going to be Northern California. Southern California, since it's not part of the same political unit, getting back to what we were talking about with water resources, it's going to have a hard time getting access to water resources that it can access easily today, because it's all California, and it's not all California anymore.
Right.
So I'm not even sure if some of the areas that are agricultural in Southern California are even able to develop agriculture, just because climatically, I guess is the way to put it, you can't really justify it down there. You need to bring in that water, and you can bring it in if the water's coming off the Sierras from the same political entity and moving within California.
Yeah. I think you would definitely see, as you see in lots of the United States today, just you heard it here first, and I don't think I'm breaking any news. Water is going to be a big thing in the next 20 to 30 years that is talked about not only in the United States politically, but globally for all kinds of reasons. We're seeing that even to some degree more and more now, but particularly in the American Southwest. I'm not saying that our now divided California from 1850, would be going to war over something, but one of the things they might be going to war over would be those water rights and the access to it, because of what it means for population centers, but also meaning for an agricultural economy.
You already have stuff like that happening between our timeline, Colorado, and Nevada, and California, and gonna go ahead and throw where you are right now into that area. Arizona as well. Yeah.
We have one more month to come up with a water sharing plan before the federal government will step in.
Yeah. And again,
I honestly don't. I don't really have high hopes that we'll be able to do it. Honestly,
it is the classic thing, looking at it from a distance, and we have issues, that spread over to where I am as well. I mean, Texas is a little bit better equipped for this, but when you get into extended drought periods like we have seen now and have seen historically over the last few decades, that resource gets precious. And back to what we do here on A Fork in Time, the aspect of a different where it's two states versus one state. That matters when it comes to how these things get decided, because we see it in the example that both of you just talked about. California and Arizona have to figure something out, and Colorado and Nevada. These are all separate states. Throw one more populous consuming state into the mix that's not a unified front. And, again, the needs in Southern California, the state that we've created, in Northern California are not exactly the same. The access is not quite exactly the same in terms of what they have innate to their borders and what they have to go and share, because it's on the border with somebody else. And you need only look at the lake level of Lake Mead to get worried about, what does this mean even for the long term? And again, I think the next great, resource war in the United States could be over something like water, or at least a political contest between states at a minimum.
Yeah.
So did we do anything here?
That is the future of this Southern California, is that it is just a ticking time bomb of this very wealthy, seemingly exceptional estate that eventually, because of its own consumerism, starting from wanting to keep the slave trade probably to modern day, is eventually starving itself.
I guess I guess that's where I go, and we probably didn't get as many details here. This was an off the cuff more type of episode, which is fine. I think these are fun to do because they're thought exercises, but I I think that an isolated, separate Southern California not having the benefits of being part of that larger union and all the things that comes with it, to Eric's point, would have a much more difficult time than the present real world southern half of California does. And the southern half of real world California has the issues you were talking about, the potential of imploding upon itself, even more so without the ability to diversify economically from a tax base, from resources, everything else that exists inside of the one big unified California that we have in the real timeline. Chris, you look like you're pondering saying something.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about kind of an earlier point of, if it's not part of the political entity with Northern California, it never has the expectation to access the kind of water from the north. So maybe it doesn't go down that path of any agricultural development to speak of, or the kind of agricultural development we have today. It's more of a petrochemical, it's more of a trading area. Port of LA Long Beach is massive and hugely important, and is a big job creator in that entire area.
And
so
would be under any timeline, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Would be under any timeline, may be more important if it doesn't have northern water, which encourages the growth of these agricultural productions that do not make any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, there's more. The agricultural parts of Southern California consume more than the people do, and the people consume a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually where the crisis comes today. I know that's not what we're about as a podcast or what we talk about, but that's the reality of this. Again, a single state dealing with this versus two separate states, as you point out, Chris, that maybe have already taken very different trajectories 50, 60, 70 years ago, just because of how this issue was evolving then. And, for example, is LA the site, is Los Angeles, again, now going back to what it would have been called, is Los Angeles, Colorado, the same size as Los Angeles, California?
I think it still would be.
I think so.
However, it would be the most haunted state, because it will be the final resting place of the Queen Mary, as Long Beach currently is. Mm-hmm. But,
I am kind of closing my eyes and picturing Colorado, California, as almost an American Dubai. Very petrochemical heavy, kind of an intellectual property, a trading center. Does that kind of strike a chord with anybody?
I can see that. The thing I guess that I struggle with is, the phenomena that we know of, whether this is fair or not. When I think Los Angeles, I think Hollywood, right? It's not that. It's it's more than that. It's, there's two major ports there, if you want to count, LA and Long Beach separately or the same. It's the agricultural areas, so it's easy to stereotype it as, well, LA is LA.
But the thing is this, to think about like how that happened. One of the primary reasons it happened was as far as you could get from Menlo Park and still be in the continental United States.
That's true.
Unless we're gonna have another massive earthquake and it break off and no longer be part of the continental United States, that's still going to be true for this area.
Right.
And it's even going to build more into kind of a hyper American Western free market zone.
I'm really thinking of it as more of like kind of the situation we have here in Arizona. There's kind of an ongoing joke with us about like, oh, what part of Phoenix are you from? And they're said like, I don't live in Phoenix. And it's like, that's funny. The whole state of Arizona is Phoenix. or at least that's how it feels to us here in Phoenix.
Right.
So I'm sure there will probably be that kind of attitude in the Southern California within LA, where it's like, yeah, everything's LA. Our cities are so close together, it's just one giant LA.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And so this is probably another one of those examples that we often run into. Yes, things are different, but some things are inevitable and they're going to be the same. They just, they have a slightly different flair to them, but there's the macro forces that are going to lead them to be what they are, right? And the location as a port, location because of trade, the fact that it is an area that is capable of thriving agriculturally if you have the water resource to support it, all of that's there.
Yeah. And I'm sure in the next 10 years, or in the last 10 years of this alternate California or alternate Southern California, like we've seen in our own, there will be some hedge fund manager with too much time deciding like, you know what, we really need to break off this Southern California into a separate state. I hate those West Southern Californians freeloading off of our beautiful coastlines.
Build a wall at the 15, something like that.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at the modern proposals of the 20 teens, you see that they come in different flavors, but most of them come in a southern northern flavor, but most of them actually break off into 3 parts. And so it really is separating the coastal parts of the southern part of the state, essentially the coastal, a little bit further inland parts of the northern part of the state, and then all of that desert stuff gets separated off into something else just because it's the rest of it. And that tends to be the flavor that's there. And again, at least 6 times since 2013, there have been various proposals that have come forward, one that made it as a ballot referendum, and they all take some flavor of what you're describing there, Eric, which is, again, it's not just 2, it's dividing into 3 because there's this Southern California has sort of 2 aspects to it now.
Yeah. After enough time, we all hate our neighbors. Maybe that's a little cynical, but maybe that's my inner Californian speaking to me.
Well, and I can speak from my inner Texan that, yes, Dallas is in Texas. It's in Yankee, Texas, but okay, we will still call it Texas, kind of thing. It works the same way. Northern California, Southern California, I know have their rivalries that aren't just around sports teams, but they have that too. But there's and even cultural differences, obviously, that exist between the two. Chris, you hit upon this earlier. Look at who were the influx of the settlers that came into the various parts of the state for the reasons that they did. The influence in the Bay Area of populations that came from Asia versus Southern California, very much influenced by Spanish, Mexican rule over time, and their ethnic differences that are, that exist in the single state today that would be not maybe as noticeable in the separate states, but they would play an aspect into those separate states.
Right. Or in some cases, like we were talking about in California, in a Colorado version of California, it may even become very prominent in the identity of Southern California.
Correct. Eric can speak to this better than I can. I only know it from the outside, but one of the things that I think of when I think of Arizona is I'm immediately heavily influenced by recognizing its Native American heritage as part of what's there. I think of Arizona having that, not just being that, but I think of it as being that. And I think we would think of Southern California probably a little bit as a separate state. It would have more of a unified identity. But for example, if I say California today to someone, they probably have a stereotype. They probably either carry the Southern version of that stereotype, I'm talking about Southern California, or the Northern version of that stereotype. And there's overlap, but they're not the same stereotype. Is that a fair thing to say?
I would say that's a fair thing to say. Like my family, we came to California from Kansas in 1900. And so if you were to ask my dad or ask my grandfather, like, what do you consider like our family history? And they would say basically California. Like when I was a kid, before I did any genealogical research, I always thought like, yeah, we came from California. Okay, what happened before that? I don't know. We were just we were there even when it's the way some people talk about like having a homeland for your people. For my family, it was always California.
Yeah.
And even now, like I live in Arizona and I love it here, but I would love one day to be able to go back to Long Beach and live in the house that my great grandparents lived in, even though it's haunted as heck and it's spooky, frankly.
Yeah. The what realistically, when we talk about the population shifts of California's growth, what are we talking about? Fourth and fifth generation Californians now, if you want to think back to the biggest booms, but really more like 3 generations back, with most of the boom being in the 40s. It's after World War II. It's the 40s and 50s forward. And to Eric's sort of point, they going back a little bit further than that, obviously, but there's what does it mean to be Californian? Well, it's a little bit like being, again, I'll reference my thing in Texan. We'll claim it, if you want to be here, you came here, you got here as fast as you could, we'll claim you. But as we get, there are a lot of folks that are first and second generation Texans, for example. I can speak to that. There's a lot of first and second generation Californians in terms of, because of the way the demographics have worked. And, there's, that influences what the state has been. It definitely influences what the state is becoming. There's no doubt about that fact over time.
Yeah. If you were to ask me how I would describe a Californian, to me, it's always someone who thinks very highly of their own intelligence, thinks charmingly of other people's intelligence, and then who can excuse a whole lot of things in order to move on, but very relaxed about it.
Yeah. And again, the perception there is, how does the East Coast view the West Coast? Is, where you get into that, how does the South of the Midwest view it as well? I think we've chased a lot. Go ahead, Eric.
In the voice of my countrymen, West Coast for life. I was just gonna say West Coast for life, Don. Always.
Yeah.
It's a Californian thing.
All right. We have definitely chased whittling creatures off the trail on this one, guys. Anybody have any closing thoughts that'll sort of bring us home or pull it all together?
One, we are going to devastate the sweatshirt industry of the San Francisco Bay Area. Because if it is not the same political entity as sunny Southern California, tourists from the rest of the country that go to San Francisco will not be expecting it to be 85 degrees when they step off the plane and have to buy a San Francisco sweatshirt. This is a thing. I've talked to Bay Area people. They know about it. And when you see somebody in a San Francisco sweatshirt, they did not realize we're not all Long Beach.
I will tell 2 stories. I will tell 2 stories that are personal that relate to that. It's interesting you should bring that up, Chris, because again, it's that concept of what is even the climate, of California. My dad was stationed in the military in the Army in the San Francisco area in the 50s, and would reference that. I guess Mark Twain was the one who at least is ascribed to have said it, that the coldest winter he ever spent was a summer in San Francisco, being the thing that's there. And then on a personal family trip in 1998 to the Bay Area, knowing, not being naive to this point that you're making there, Chris, knowing that we needed to pack appropriately with, sweaters and longer sleeve things, even though we were going there in July. We actually went down and watched the July 4th fireworks down basically directly next to Ghirardelli Chocolate down on down near the pier there, looking out over Alcatraz.
Fisherman's Wharf.
Fisherman's Wharf, looking out towards the Golden Gate Bridge. By the way, only knowing it was a fireworks show because occasionally there were flashes of light in the clouds and fog that rolled in.
Yeah.
But sitting there on the water edge on July 4th, freezing.
Yeah.
And shivering. My Alexis, known to this podcast, is 7 at the time. And eventually, it's like, do we really have to be out here? Said the 7-year-old to her parents, because it was not a fun place to be, even though it was, San Francisco on the 4th of July and we were loving it. is, but to your point, Chris, you're right. It would hurt it would hurt the tourism garment industry in the Bay Area because they would lose the concept that some people have about how to pack in July if you're coming to California.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. No doubt about that. Eric, any closing thoughts?
Upton Sinclair becomes governor of Northern California in 1934.
Okay, that's a whole other circle. They can circle back to that as an
I know. I thought it was just fun to speculate, but yeah, I think we kind of hit the hammer or hit the nail right on the head here of just like Southern California sounds like a great idea until it becomes real.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, it was good to be with you here today. It's good to be back, actually putting an episode together. So I appreciate that. As we told our listeners, we're trying to get back in the habit of things. We appreciate your patience as this thing called real life gets in the way of doing this little thing we do on the side here called Fork in Time. But I'm appreciative of Chris. Chris did an excellent job of keeping the chair warm and moving it forward. And the work that you and the rest of folks did in terms of rolling out episodes was very much appreciated. I do appreciate that, all the efforts there and the leading out, and of course, the whole team as well. I don't have anything else to say except that I'm going to sign off for this episode and just remind our listeners, as we always do, if you happen upon that Fork in Time, our strong suggestion is to take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.